So last week we spent a majority of our time talking about the Restoration period, that brief 20-year period or so where the monarchy is restored and Charles II takes the throne up until the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century in 1700. So this period, after the Age of Dryden or the Restoration period, uh, takes place between 1700 and 1789, and it's often called the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason or Enlightenment really starts in Europe, and it's this intellectual and literary movement that emphasizes or focuses on rationalism, where the role of reason takes the place of sensory experiences or faith in answering basic questions about human experience. Some ideals that it emphasizes are intellectual freedom and freedom from prejudice and superstition in religion and politics. However, that kind of changes because remember, things happen in Europe and on the continent before they happen in England. Like the Renaissance happened in England before, or the Renaissance happened in Europe before it happened in England, and the Enlightenment era kind of happens on the continent before it happens in England. And it's much the same in England, except there's this idea of English rationalism that is inspired by John Locke, who we'll read this week, where he says experience and reason should be given equal place when examining the human condition. And basically, in England, we have an age that is concerned with understanding themselves, understanding the immediate world, understanding their relationship with others, and this age where morals and manners kind of take center stage, which we'll talk about. I know you've heard me talk about the various different names given to the period of this unit, and sometimes it's confusing. People call it the Restoration, the 18th century, the Neoclassical Augustan age, but in this period, during the kind of Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, this is a period where facades are very important. In some ways, the country is trying to act like the English Civil War had never happened, and there's both a willful suppression of the immediate past and a glorification of the more distant classical Roman past, which is why it's sometimes called the Neoclassical period, which I'm going to come back to at the end of this lecture, so hold tight. But this is also a period of conscious self-awareness. People looked at themselves and kept asking, am I playing my role correctly? And after the Great Fire of London, they had a chance to totally reinvent their capital city and did so in a way that let them kind of mask their past. I mean, if you think about what we read last week with John Dryden's uh, Year of Wonders and the new vision of London, there really is this new vision of London that, and this new center of power, this center of wealth, this center of social change. And it really begins with a new definition and a rise of a new type of middle class that comes from the building of a new metropolis area. Last week we discussed a lot of the Restoration, and in this week we're going to talk, like I said, about the early 18th century. But you'll remember that King Charles's reign was defined by decadence and debauchery, but it was also a time of civil profitability and military unrest. Britain was involved in a series of commercial wars against the Dutch, French, Austrian, Spanish, and eventually its own American colonists over lucrative trade opportunities in the New World and in the South Seas. During the early 18th century, the great privateer pirate trade and the celebration of military supremacy was a lot like the dot-com boom of the late 20th century. And the early 18th century was a time of sudden new wealth based on the beginnings of the stock exchange, of investment schemes, and all the accompanying commercialism and materialism that accompany newfound affluence. And we talked a little bit last week about the new political parties in Parliament, where we have the conservative Tories, or the old landed money, versus the new money, or the Whigs. And this really starts, there are majority, we see more and more people becoming new money versus kind of the old money, and they lose money and all that kind of stuff. But the new money married the old money, but the new money isn't cultured. And keep that idea in the back of your mind. This was also an age where economics were the justification for participating in the Caribbean slave trade, colonial expansion into India, and eventually Australia and the Far East, and the enclosure of public grazing lands and anti-poaching laws in commercial forests. Basically, we see during this period Britain shifting from a kingdom to an empire, and that shift has its costs. Another word besides facade that kind of describes the neoclassical age of enlightenment, or age of reason, is complacency. This was an age where comfort was celebrated, and that's kind of a byproduct of the King Charles's reign. But the British felt relatively invincible politically, which led to an assumption of their moral and intellectual supremacy. This is an age of the rise of the middle class. They were obsessed with proving they had good taste. So gentlemen flocked to coffee houses. Coffee houses become a thing during this time in the city of London to discuss the latest periodicals, while ladies organized elaborate rituals for drinking that expensive, bitter, new imported beverage, chocolate. It is an age of conspicuous consumption. For the first time, periodicals are filled with advertisements for home decorations, fashion, and furniture. Architecture enters the Baroque period, and it becomes very important to wear clothing by the best designers, to have your hair done by the best hairdressers, and so on and so forth. People whose parents were servants now had servants themselves. And this age of complacency is marked by a significant rise in literacy, because for the first time, the middle class had time for leisure and wanted entertainment to fill it. This is the age of the rise of the newspaper and the periodical, the return of the public theater, and the birth of the novel. So we've got all of these really great, wonderful literary developments during this time. It's also an age where verbal skill and brilliant verbal repartee counted. None of that shouting and lack of decorum. And this was an age of polished debate and clever talking. One of the key words for the entire period is wit, as we found with Dryden last week in his definition of satire. What makes a witty man? And you should watch for this word wit, because it comes up again this week and next week, and so on and so forth, because it's crucial to understanding the period. Not only were upper class courtiers expected to show this kind of witty verbal mastery, now everyone with money was supposed to be verbally talented. So people sent their sons on the grand tour of Europe to give them polish, while they taught their daughters just enough French and Italian words to drop into their conversation to make them seem sophisticated. There we have that kind of idea of facades again. Not coincidentally, this age of wit is also the time when formal study of the English language gains impetus. It is a time of grammar books, histories of the language, and dictionaries, which we'll talk about a little bit later. However, this commercialism . gains this or produces this concern with public appearance. It becomes very important to be fashionable and have fashionable furniture, and to have your hair done by hairdressers, because in this period we have some new professions like fashion designers, bootmakers, dancing masters, professional portrait painters. Everybody wanted to look right, act right, and have a house that looked right. And as long as they had money, they could buy what would give them the look. So this emphasis on looking right and acting right also meant that people had to act right. So great value was placed on manners, on virtues like self-control and self-governance, and above all, kind of this balance. People were supposed to be in control, to show control, to not rebel or act out or be outrageous. And at the same time, there was a certain guilty pleasure in those outbursts. So, anyways, this was also all of these changes in society and in changes in the middle class and all of that kind of thing. It ultimately produces profound changes for literature. This emphasis on self-reflection meant that journals or genres like diaries, letters, and essays were more popular and often read alone in a reading room. And at the same time, the new social fluidity meant that genres like newspapers and periodicals become popular. Journalism becomes a power for the first time, and Fleet Street, where most of the journalists live, became a powerful center of the city. They really stand in for those middle class values. There's not so many restrictions on censorship, and two of the most prominent pieces of or periodicals of the time, the Tatler and the Spectator, which we're going to talk about this week, are meant to be both entertaining and instructive. And the purpose of these journals or journalists of the 18th century, they were meant to be reporters, but they were also meant to be reformers of public manners and morals. In this age, we have the birth of English prose, where there's this new popularity of pamphlets and travel writing that call for more precise and plain, exact writing. So we have shortening of these really kind of long sentences, which I know that you guys are happy to hear. Another form of literature of the time is satire, which we will be talking about extensively next week. But it was aimed at these elite classes because during this time, it's a time of instruction, it's a time of change, it's a time of didacticism, is for lack of a better word. But there is this focus on order and discipline, and this idea of bad taste that's usually found in the upper class. So we'll talk more about this next week. But the point that I'm trying to make is during this age, we are in this age of conversation. We have all sorts of other new genres like biographies, histories, philosophies, writings with politics that aren't censored anymore, economics, dictionaries, diaries, and letters. And then ultimately, one of the greatest developments of the age is the novel, which is where we're going to end up at the end of our semester. So the one thing that I do want to mention is that this is particularly the Actually, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up.